Greetings, everyone, and welcome to TRG 30, our last in this extraordinary year of 2020, TRG 30, where we always every week talk bold change for our sector's resilience. And today we'll be talking about that change looking back so that we can imagine, frame priorities for ourselves moving forward. This episode today, I want you to be listening for these three things. First, my guest and I will be talking sector realities, aggregated realities. So be thinking about how your organization compares to those realities and what it might mean. Bright spots, we'll also be talking about bright spots, and they were there. You know that. You may work in an organization that was one. Share that with us. Tell us in the chat. Send me a note. We want to continue to inspire you as we move into 2021. So think of yourself in that context and those around you. And finally, resolutions. It's unbelievable that it's that time of the year. So we'll frame up some that we think you might want to have, but what action can you take based on what you're thinking now, what you hear today, that might have a positive impact on 2021? And without any further ado, I want to welcome my friend, my colleague, Zannie Voss, who is the director of SMU Data Arts. For our international audiences, DataArts is an organization situated within Southern Methodist University in Dallas. They are the largest researchers and organization that researches and aggregates studies and provides insights to the arts and cultural sector in America. Zannie, it's so great to have you here. Welcome to you, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Jill. It's great to be here with you.
And again, so it's you and I did this earlier in the year when we could only see so far. And as we approached, as I invited you to join me to look back on this year, there's lots of data and insight to share. I want to invite you to start with some pre-pandemic insight. There are a couple of findings and work that your team did that relate to how we experienced this year, this pandemic, which also exposed our need to reconcile systemic racism. It elevated that dialogue deeply. And this first bit of insight that you'll share is about that, in fact.
Right. Well, thank you, Jill. So this first, this was heading into the crisis, and we are in the midst of a study of 23 large performing arts organizations in 9 major markets. So it's combining TRG data with CDP data and some other data sources. And it's a robust set of data. It's 1.9 million households, 18 million transactions. And here's the reality that we found, that the large performing arts organizations underrepresent the racial and income diversity of the general population of the communities in which they reside by more than half. So, here you see 17% of customers are African American, Latinx, Asian American, and Native American, whereas 44% of the local population has these characteristics. Similarly, with respect to income, 14% of customers and yet 42% of the population, households earning under $50,000.
So as Zannie's video is interrupted there for a moment, I'm confident she'll come back on. And as you think about the environment we found ourselves in and the conversations that we began to have related to just cause and where and how we need to resituate ourselves post-pandemic, this reality about our communities and how arts and cultural audiences are, what the realities of them are compared to our populations. This really helped us see why some of that dialogue took place. Zannie, welcome. I just offered that this created a comparison point, and it helps illustrate why these conversations we've been having have felt so poignant. Another part that felt poignant is our financial infrastructure heading in to the pandemic.
Here we're taking a look at average working capital heading into the storm. So when we think of working capital, it's really a barometer of financial health is flexible liquidity, right?
Right.
What's the current assets less current liabilities on an organization's ability to absorb shock brought about by unexpected events like we had this year. And you can see here on average, a few major museums skew their sectors high. But you
Right.
can also see that all of the performing arts sectors had just about 3 months or less of working capital. If we were to look at the median or the midpoint in the range rather than the mean of working capital, we'd actually see that this means that at least half of the organizations had less than 1.5 months of working capital, or the equivalent of about 13% of annual expenses. And this is when times were good.
Right.
I want to point out a side note that the BIPOC organizations, they had equal or more liquidity than organizations serving a general public, which is
Hmm.
a fascinating, interesting
Hmm.
finding. When you don't have necessarily access to the same kinds of banking relationships to be able to get loans, et cetera, you become so much more self-sufficient.
Hmm.
And so this was really just kind of highlighting how unprepared most organizations were to weather a storm.
Yeah, I mean, I think about running my own business and the insecurity that having only a month's worth of expenses on hand. And as you and I headed into the spring, we authored the long haul report, and then your team had done a deep dive into the data and told this story.
Right. So, and this was at the start of the pandemic, as Jill said.
Right.
So these were really optimistic estimates. At the time, we worked with 7 national service organizations on their members' estimates of when they would reopen, and the average was October. So think about that. We estimated a $6.8 billion net loss, so $12.4 billion loss of revenue offset with $5.5 billion net expense reduction. We see that these estimates were wildly optimistic, and yet, even by these optimistic standards, the field was unprepared to weather the storm. Remember, I said 1.5 months of working capital for as median.
Right.
Whereas here it was looking at 3 months of expenses. So
Right. The impact, we see it, right? So there's data points that are here. Describe this.
These are data points from AFTRA's national survey, and estimating right now 10% of organizations say they're not confident that they're going to survive. This comes to about 12,000 organizations around the country. Currently 59% of organizations remain closed, and 99% of the performing arts organizations have canceled some programming.
We were
In addition,
together about the 1%. Sorry, but it was like, what 1% did not close at all? Like, who was that? Education organizations? You were speculating other things, but it's amazing that even 1% did not close anything.
right. In addition, for museums, AAM did a survey, and they say up to 33% of museums may shutter forever if there's not some intervention from public or private funding. And Colleen Dillenschneider's survey saying that the earliest that we're going to get back to 2019 revenue levels will be 2022. So this makes me think about, in the report we talked about, and when your doors will reopen, whom will you gather? Thinking about this is a time, if we're not going to get back to 2022, of how can we start to rethink some of our operations.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that, you and I. So that data looks primarily at America, the US. Our attendees here know our company is international. I love this artist, Muckrock, who apparently is showing up in lots of places in the UK, but our work and data study client relationships are there too. So let's talk about that for a moment. In the United Kingdom, in January and February, we had a slow start to the year there for ticket sales compared to 2019. March sales fell harder and faster than North America, whose organizations can depend on subscriber kind of sales income and behavior in a different way than in the UK. And then, not unlike the US, there was a bit of schizophrenia and tension as the government was both encouraging reopening, and then there were U-turns about that. And that got sort of settled a bit when DCMS announced the Cultural Recovery Fund. I always have a hard time saying that. Almost $1.6 billion, a game changer for sure. It allowed the reimagining about reopening, imagining about recovery with social distancing and enabled performances, as well as alleviated the risk of cancellations that we now, because of closures, are seeing for sure throughout the UK. Financials on an aggregated basis, income financials on the ticket sales side since 2019, this is data from this week from our COVID sector benchmark that SMU is a partner on, that the NEA has helped to support here in America. 73% lower ticket sales revenue in North America, 76% in the UK. Different story in philanthropy. In the US, we have seen growth in, growth of smaller donors and real lean in from major donors that has resulted in, obviously not growth in a pandemic, but less of an impact than we might have feared. Same is true in the UK, where we saw ticket buyers donate tickets and growth of philanthropy as people began to reconcile the need to lean in. And yet, none of this data is positive. It's depressing. But there are bright spots here. There are bright spots that are financial, that relate to financial successes, resilient planning, and exceptionally, I've really seen leaders emerge with confidence and optimism and skill. Elizabeth Newman is a great example at Pitlochry Festival Theatre in Scotland, created and are leading with this mantra we heard a couple of weeks ago: light, hope, and joy, that is trying to affect everything they do. They've created one of the top holiday events in the UK, reaching entirely new audiences. Orchestras, we heard from Eric Ginsler last week, they've embraced digital as a new space for sharing personal performances from home. And individual leaders, Amanda Berg at the Catamounts here in Colorado, and Hannah Sharif at the Rep Theater of St. Louis, who was the first early in the pandemic to join a sector forum we hosted and said, the future is now. I thought I had a few years, I don't. There's good news, in fact, though, that the future is now. Matthew Loden at the Toronto Symphony, who's been working with his team to connect with the community and patrons in a profoundly personal and effective way. And we heard from Caroline Miller about the new entrepreneurial ways that she and her brand new artistic director are leading at the Ballet Company in Birmingham, England. Zannie, you have examples of bright spots too.
Certainly do. We're wrapping up some research into high-performing BIPOC organizations with the Wallace Foundation right now, and it's a much broader study, but here are just two examples of organizations that are seizing the moment and finding ways to serve their communities with relevant work at a really high level. I want to share a couple of quotes. This is Blake Anthony Johnson, who's the CEO at Chicago Sinfonietta. The reason why our financial models look so different, it goes down to mission. Chicago Sinfonietta champions diversity, equity, and inclusion by creating community through these bold symphonic experiences. The clarity of mission cuts through quite a bit of noise. And Zanetta Drew with Dallas Black Dance Theater. This is the most exciting time of my 34 years right now. Traditional hindrances to change and new ways of doing business are gone. All the old ways of operating are now being reinvented daily. They are reinventing operations. They are putting paid programming up for virtual audiences, building new audiences in ways that they perhaps had a desire before COVID, but this gave them the freedom and the inspiration to say, let's try, and are meeting with success, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's important to be reminded that positive change is happening as we think about your organization's future of 2021 and what you might resolve to do, building on some of these examples, I would say investing in relationships is must be a key part of how we think about 2021. Current audiences, current patrons will continue to invest in our recovery. I'm confident about that. But man, this is the year where we must act on the both and. Building relevancy. You heard Zannie talk about it in our communities to support long-term just cause viability. And relationships aren't limited to external. Your internal relationships are critical. It's critical that your board, staff, volunteers are heard, respected, rewarded, and stewarded. Zannie, working capital.
Yeah, build working capital, that very unsexy topic that everybody actually has to be able to master in order to get to some long-term stability. Create new risk tolerance. When organizations have sufficient working capital, they can manage, they can take risks. And many of the old ways of working right now simply are not possible and may not yield the results even if they were. So being able to have some risk capital is going to come from building working capital. Allow for longer term planning and relationship building. In and of itself, sometimes the act of creating a roadmap to attaining financial stability feeds optimism, inspires confidence, it inspires excitement. It's creating this financial roadmap that plots out how and over what time frame the organization plans to achieve its savings goals. Uh, People, you only succeed if people want you to succeed. And if they do, they're going to be invested and make sure that it happens. And then create a plan B. When times were good, we had worked with TCG on a paper about heading into the recession. And we kept saying over and over again, the times are good now. This is the time to build working capital. And in asking organizations, how many of you have a plan B? No hands go up. Don't get caught in this vulnerable position again. In the process of creating reserves, consider what's going to give you the ability to pivot when you need to pivot, and to create now through scenario planning, through working with organizations like National Coalition of Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. How are you going to deal with the next crisis, whatever that may be?
This concept of working capital and the long term and plan Bs all sort of weave together in my mind a little bit. But I think the thing that catches my attention the most is this tension, Zannie, between the 2021 year, and for many that will go toward the 21-22 season, and the requirements, the financial requirements to be sustainable, the revenue requirements to be sustainable, and how that could be in tension with our desire to connect with the community. And you and I had a brief conversation about that before we got on this roundtable, and you said, Jill, it's really a question of how we measure growth, right?
It's this long time mantra that's been in the field about growth is good. In this moment, organizations out of necessity are having to scale back budgets. And when I think about there's a trade-off, right? There's a tension that comes with saying, when we reopen, we're going to need a revenue engine. Do we go back to prioritizing relationship development only with a high net worth customer base to say, let's get back into that growth is good mindset? Or is this really a moment where you can consider prioritizing, asking kind of the big questions about equitable representativeness? The critical nature of a broader footprint of relevance for a community, and the going from growth is good to serving people whom we have underserved in our community is good. And is our organizations willing to say, we're going to forego some budget growth if it means we're better able to be relevant to more people in our community who may not necessarily have the same means, the deepest pockets that our customer base had before the pandemic? And that's a difficult choice to make, but it is important for organizations to contemplate at this moment in time.
Well, it is a moment in time, but I also think it's about this issue of long-term viability. I mean, you look at the pre-pandemic data, and any of you in this virtual room, look at your communities. What we knew before the pandemic is the boomer generation is aging. We know that immigration and other demographic changes globally are affecting the composition of communities. So it is both righteous and the right long-term strategy for viability to make sure that we are reflecting the changing community in which we operate, whatever that means. There's not one answer for all. The other thing that I just want to get in before Stephen takes the mic is databases as an asset on a balance sheet. I want so much for those of us who are thinking about 2021 to think about that database as something that we need to build equity in and manage, because those who did had an easier time this year and will next year than those who didn't, and it will apply to new audiences too. Stephen, make me stop talking.
I just came on early to point out you said dollar when there was a pound sign, and I always enjoy pointing that one out. I know I had to for our UK guests. We enjoy doing that. We enjoy doing that. Right, the questions are pouring in, so you just pop them into the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we're going to start with Ben, who talks about human capital deficit, and asks, he worries that even as we celebrate the greater solvency of BIPOC organizations as measured by reserves, we don't measure the human capital deficit these organizations incur by virtue of compensation and benefit levels. Is there any research measuring human capital performance in organizations compared either to other disciplines or other industries to help us understand the depth of this deficit? Zannie, I wonder if...
Yeah, Ben, thank you for the question. We're actually in the process of examining exactly that point through the project that I mentioned with Wallace. That research will come out in January. But clearly, this balance of saying, yes, they may have healthy working capital, but that actually masks a lack of organizational capacity. And by that, I mean fewer staff, lower compensation, and heavier burden on the backs of fewer people. And so what we've heard over and over again is through the course of these interviews and in understanding the organizations is that in order for long-term stability and growth to happen for organizations who want growth, the investment has to be made not just in working capital, but in people. You know, giving organizations the human resources, the capabilities, the skills, the bandwidth that they need in order to carry this out. Part of that comes from lack of access to equitable funding over time, that they haven't had necessarily the same access to institutional funders, and oftentimes are serving an audience base that perhaps is low income. And if that's the case, then how are you going to be able to help to foster an infrastructure within the organization that's going to allow it to continue to do its good work and to grow without really trying to kill the people who are there carrying out the good work of the organization? There's an incredible amount of burnout, despite the passion and the sense of relevancy. Jill, do you have any thoughts to share?
Only that this is an issue, I think, for arts and culture writ large. It is exacerbated in the ways that you've described in these communities. But boy, investment in people so that organizations can be the most brilliant they can be has caught my attention for our sector writ large.
Anna asked a question around the prognosis for the return of subscription sales to pre-pandemic levels, given that single ticket sales are surging to support digital content, videos of performances gaining traction. The good news is that new distant audiences are being gained, but if they're not local, they cannot attend performances when things get back to normal.
Yeah. Anna, this is a great time for creativity around relationship and loyalty. And I dare say that while we believe and have seen the data that the subscription as a tool has been a very successful part of loyalty infrastructure. It's just a tactic. So the question that I think we all have to be thinking about is what are the assets we have? What are the channels we have? And how do we create invitations that encourage Jill to want to continue to engage digitally, remotely, locally? And this, I think, will be, I'm excited about these planning sessions we're going to be having next year around this very thing. And I expect we'll get very creative.
Ben asks another question around, he says, in this pressed moment, the temptation is to devote all resources to propping up current programs, even while the changing world demands that organizations experiment and try new things. There have been many suggestions around capital structure, for example, minimum working capital fund equal to 3 months of expenses. Do you have recommendations on how much organizations should try to dedicate consciously to organizational experimentation? And just to tag on there, Lenore also asks what the best strategies are for building working capital too.
For, I think part of having working capital is having its risk capital, so there's not a one size fits all right answer to what level of working capital should an organization have. If an organization wants to be more experimental, then we encourage higher levels of working capital to support that risk, so that if the risk is not met with a lot of success financially, then it's not going to bring the organization under. Different strategies, set a savings plan. After the organization is open again, budget to surpluses. Saying if we wanted to save for 3 months of working capital over the next 3 years, then budget an extra month of surpluses for the next 3 years. Have that financial roadmap with savings goals that you're able to meet along the way. Consider having a cash reserve campaign at some point and making sure that, as you're building assets, you're building liquidity first and not just building fixed assets with respect to capital campaigns, thinking about what is the order of assets to build. And I'm happy to share, there's a white paper on our website that we did with Rebecca Thomas called 5 Steps to Healthy Working Capital. And Rebecca is a wonderful resource for thinking deeply about all of the reasons why working capital can give you the freedom to not only weather a storm, but to be innovative in the ways that you want to be.
Jill, I wonder if you might just take this last short answer to this question from Lenore. In order to serve the currently underserved segments of our community, how do we get our boards to support the revamping and revisioning of our programs?
There is no one size fits all answer here either, but I've been inspired by conversations that we've helped make happen that imagine imagining the most vibrant relationship in my community for my organization after the pandemic, like visioning exercises that say, equipped with some data, like here's some realities about my city. And let's imagine and describe how our organization could be the most vibrant and the most high impact and work back from there. I think if you can find a way to ignite imagination, either through outside facilitation or your own just time together, it can happen. It just requires time, a little bit of data, and doing it after you've had a bit of rest, maybe.
Well, talking of rest, we're at time, and it's our final TRG 30 roundtable of the year. We will be back in 2021, and we'll be in touch with you about that in the new year. However you celebrate this holiday season, we hope you have some good rest, and we do wish you a happy new year. And we'll be excited to see you back around this virtual roundtable in January. And we'll let you know the date at the top of 2021. And Jill, it's been a pleasure to share the last, nearly 9 months with you on this now. And Zannie, thank you so much for joining us today and seeing the year out. Really
thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Happy
Thank you all.
December holidays, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.